Grateful for the opportunity. There are three of us, Kazuhiro Teruya, Isaac Minbaro and myself, and also future events. And I hope we have an axis of good between Tunisia and Hong Kong. So it is a wonderful opportunity, and I was thinking about, well, we'll also have the celebration of Michael Halliday's 90th birthday this evening, so that's great. It'd be wonderful to be able to celebrate it. The actual birthday is on the 13th of April. As it happens, it's my mother's birthday today. She would have been 102 today. And the last place we talked about going on vacation together was Tunisia, but it never happened. But better, late than never. So it is a special day. We're now halfway into the first day of the program, right? We'll make sure that we end promptly because we have parallel sessions starting right after. And Robin, if I can see, where are you, Robin? Yes, there. It's the projector blinds me a bit. Will monitor me and make sure that I stop on time, right? So wherever we are, we'll stop. The idea was to talk about multilingual studies. It seems quite appropriate, so we discussed this before. There are many things one could talk about. Because among other things, this is of course an opportunity where presentations on different languages are offered. Already this morning I've heard a very interesting presentation on projection in modern standard Arabic, projection in news reports in particular, and that resonates beautifully with the colloquium we will have tomorrow on projection in different languages and the manifestations of projections in different languages. So that also has this link to multilingual studies. Now, what do we understand by multilingual studies? Well, it's a term we introduced, Kazuhiro Teruya, Wu Tsandong and myself, in 2008. It's an attempt to bring together sort of communities of discourse, activities, areas of publication, conference and so on, that typically are far apart. Say, for example, translation studies and linguistic typology, or say language description and the sort of education in foreign second languages, right? Because we felt over the years, and also had opportunities to explore this in practice, that would be very valuable to have more dialogue, more exchange, mutual exchange of ideas, new ways of exploring issues, and that's part of the idea of multilingual studies. Now you can look at it as everything else in systemic functional linguistics, both as reflection, so this is a more ideation aspect, sort of just coming to understand issues having to do with multilinguality very broadly interpreted, both personal and communal, right? So process of analysis, description, comparison, contrast, typology that involve a single, few, or lots of languages. But then also the more active intervention aspects, where we draw on what we have produced, knowledge about different aspects of multilingual phenomena, in teaching and learning, in training, say in translator-interpreter training, for example, translation as a professional activity, planning, I'm talking about language planning for example, and all other modes of application. So in fact, what we're looking at is sort of some notion of applicable multilingual studies, taking Michael Halliday's idea from about more than 10 years ago, of a kind of synthesis between the two positions of theoretical linguistics and applied linguistics. And synthesizing these as applicable linguistics, meaning a kind of linguistics that has the power, the potential to be applied, okay? And where the theory and the descriptions are created with a view to this potential for application, right? So that is very much also the idea of bringing communities of discourse, of practice together that have been priced apart through the development of largely sort of Chomskyan theoretical linguistics since the early 60s. Okay? So it's an attempt to overcome this. So when we talk about multilingual studies, there are these two aspects, reflection and application, so applicable. Now, today I will be more on the reflection part and take up some features, some properties, leaving the possibility of application to some other context, but it's always there, and it's been very important to us. Now, one way if you reflect on it, one way of saying what's the scope of multilingual studies is to say, well, very simply, we can sort of set up a two-dimensional space defined by the Klein instantiation from the system, the overall potential of languages at one end, to, at the other end, text, instances of language, text in context and situation. So in between these two poles, or at these two poles, you could have activities in the form of multilingual studies. But then another obvious dimension is simply few languages versus many languages. So you can see certain regions have been populated. So for example, you can take a combination of few languages, looking at few languages and instances. Well, that's where a lot of the focus of translation studies has been. Okay? Now, you can then shunt along both dimensions and arrive at another core of activity. So you move right back to the system, the systems of languages, and then increase the number to many languages. And that, of course, that's where we then enter the territory of typological studies. Okay? But in between, we have other possibilities. Comparative studies, for example, and comparative studies could be a kind of gateway interface between translation studies and typological studies. And that was indeed, in the 1960s, how systemic functional linguists like Ian Catford and Geoffrey Ellis conceived of the territory, right? When they talked about comparison, typology, and also Michael Halliday in early contributions. And so we can, push either in one direction or another. But part of this, we might say, called a research program, multilingual studies, is to make connections. So to connect translation studies to comparison, as people like Foljeloid, Elke Teich and others have done. We can also try to connect translation studies to typological studies. There are a lot of interesting possibilities here, and that's only on the reflection part. And we could say, what would it mean to implement this in a program of education, and the notion of sort of training people in languages by sort of developing their multilingual meaning potentials. Now, if you look at what people say about different languages, and of course, the traditional engaging with different languages is very deep in systemic functional linguistics, and it goes back to J.R. Firth's work. But if you look around what people say, then you sort of often come across as sort of concerns with famous features of languages. Since we're here in Tunisia, one very famous feature is of Arabic, but also Semitic languages in general. There's what one might characterize as a template and overlay morphology. Okay? So you have radicals, for example, or f, ein, l, and then you have different overlays on these, right? Kataba, kitaban, yaktubu, and so on. And that's a very, very interesting kind of word grammar that's fairly unique around the language of the world, and poses particular problems to approaches that are very structure-based. So syntagmatic approaches to grammar, to morphosyntax, morphology. But if you have a systemic-based, then in some sense you can develop the description independent of the problems of, as it were, overlaying a pattern of consonants and vowels on essentially a consonant template, right? So that's very, very important. So the system is an important contribution. Staying in this continent, the noun classes of Bantu languages, very famous of that, agreements with verbs and so on. Serial verb constructions, if we travel to West Africa, and then we could bounce back to South Asia, and find very similar interesting patterns, or New Guinea. Nominal tense in certain languages, say of the Americas, like Guarani. Evidentiality, very little, it would seem, here in this continent, but very common in the Americas. So, for example, in Quechua, it would have been very good if a news reporting had developed with a language like Quechua, where you have to always say, what's my source of information? That's an evidentiality system. It would be interesting to see what news reporting would look like. Directionals, so in a sense, a spatial and analog of tense in certain languages. This is something you always have to mark. Hakathet, for example, again from the Americas. And then what would appear, if you come from a language like Arabic, Spanish or English, to be extreme, languages with very, very small verb inventories, like Kalam, language of the highlands of Papua New Guinea, with only a bit over 100 verbs, so a closed verb inventory. Okay? So languages or sets of languages become famous in this way, and that's of course interesting and well worth noting. But in multilingual studies, what we want is a kind of systematic, systemic approach to this. So not just cherry-picking features that seem unusual, exotic, but to bring them within an overall systemic understanding of a given language. So as a system of systems. Okay? So a key goal then is to find descriptive generalizations. So generalizations about strategies for realizing systemic distinctions in mood would be an example. Or models for construing quantile change in our experience of the flow of events. Or models for construing unfolding of process in time. And behind this is an interest in what are the dimensions of similarity and difference among languages that systemic functional linguistics can identify and help us with. Okay. Now I will touch on one or two of these, but let me start being concerned with what we might say specifically systemic multilingual studies. So multilingual studies is not a brand name. You could do it in any framework or eclectically. But systemic or systemic functional multilingual studies then is an approach to multilingual studies that incorporates some of the key properties, all of the key properties of systemic functional linguistics. I'm not blocking anything. Yes, I am. You have a beautiful silhouette on the screen. Okay, so just briefly I want to point out that systemic functional multilingual studies you have on top, of course, it is in constant dialogue, in constant exchange with other approaches, other frameworks, other traditions that have been concerned with any aspects of multilingual studies. So from descriptions of different languages to functional typological work to typological databases that are World Atlas of Language Structures. I will illustrate this for the last one, for WALS, World Atlas of Language Structures, a little bit how one can have a dialogue and draw on these resources. So we translate, we synthesize into systemic functional linguistics, so we know how things belong together. But what are the special features of systemic functional multilingual studies? Well, as a kind of shorthand, I would say systemic, of course. Oriented towards paradigm rather than syntagm in the first instance. But then critically, and there's something I would like to spend a little bit of time on, multilingual systems. So we've had system networks now since the 1960s, but the idea of an explicitly multilingual system network is something that it's actually been around and developed for about 20 years, but it's been more on the periphery of the sort of main scene of action in systemic functional linguistics. But metafunctional, very important, that's part of the theory, right? Meaning-oriented, say if we locate it looking at the lexicogramma, and meaning-oriented in context, so anything we do will be informed by this. Text-based, so even if we're concerned with the description or comparison of systems, this ought to be text-based in a very serious way, through manual analysis, automated analysis, and sort of registerially informed text selection and so on. And behind this, of course, is precisely the combination of the notion of a holistic theory. So while we think about comparison, and we think about typology, not of whole languages, as folks did in the 19th century, you know, the grand typologies based on morphology, polysynthetic, analytic, and so on, but rather systems like mood, tense, polarity, okay? Because whole languages are too complex to be compared as a whole, but holistic rather in the sense that we can place anything we're looking at in relation to everything else, and that's part of being a relational theory, and that also makes contact with modern systems thinking, sort of thinking about complex adaptive systems, like in the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico in the US. Okay? Now, I could take any of these and show what the implications are from an approach to SFL approach to multilingual studies, but I'll focus in the first instance on systemic ones. Okay? And if we sort of say, well, what would it mean for the clause? Then we could look at this from the different, in terms of the different metafunctions, systems in the different metafunctions, and I'll give a little bit of sampling if I'm talking fast enough. The organization will be around the system and developing the sort of notional system in multilingual studies. Now, in a sense, one of the central tasks is to come to terms with some kind of balance when you look around the languages of the world between similarity and difference, between what is recurrent in languages, so that's what you have talked, I'll enlarge that in a second, and where languages tend to differ, and see if there are principal patterns in this, where we can expect to find more similarity or congruence across languages, and where we can expect to find more difference. Okay? And systemic functional linguistics as a holistic theory comes with a number of theoretical dimensions. So I've mentioned 4 here: stratification, rank, axis, delicacy. And in our work in this area over the years, we found that in terms of all these, you can make certain generalizations about where you find more similarity or less variation and more variation. So the top of this figure simply says we're looking in general sort of some kind of continuum scale between more similar and more different, and then we're asking across the system of a language and across languages, how will this scale be mapped onto or manifested like a fractal principle in other dimensions of the language. Okay? And 2 that I will have the time to say something about today. These are delicacy, right, and what goes together with delicacy. So from low delicacy to high delicacy. And also paradigmatic organization and syntagmatic organization. So system, structure. And the manifestation of this general principle is low delicacy, you tend to find more congruence across languages. Okay? So say very general distinctions in transitivity, very general distinctions in mood. Now you have to take this not with a grain of salt, but with a bushel of salt. But still, as a general guiding heuristic principle, it's helpful. Whereas you move towards more delicate distinctions, you're likely to find more variation. Okay? So that in itself is helpful. And you can think about this in the implications of this in the application language teaching. So if we have this sort of sense, how could that guide a modern 21st century contrastive analysis? So Robert Glado and company from the late 50s, Mark II. Now, systemic, meaning-oriented, text-based, in context, not just structure-based. And then similarly, axis. In general, with bushels of salt, you tend to get more congruence across languages systemically, paradigmatically than structurally. And here, of course, is very interesting because the vast majority of typological studies have been structure-focused for understandable reasons. So that may hide sort of recurrent patterns across languages. Now, to work with this, then, we need multilingual systemic networks. And then that goes back to something that we originally invented, let me say, in the early 90s in the context of computational modeling, what Robin referred to. Okay? So it came out of there. It was something that John Bateman and I worked with, and then we were joined by Zheng Li Chang, and we produced, well, John and Li Chang produced tweaked the computational system so one could represent multilingual system networks. But we also worked on descriptions together and also with other people. This is now almost a quarter of a century ago. So, what's the principle? It's very simple. So, multilingual representation of access and delegacy, meaning, you should be able to represent the sustaining aspect multilingually. Okay? So, more generally, then addition of representative power to system networks. You just expand the representative power in the multilingual direction. So, to be able to retain the integrity of discussion of individual languages, that's absolutely essential. Okay? And we do this through language-specific partitions of the system networks. So you can think of a multilingual system network that integrates, unifies, and the second principle here, unifies descriptions into a multilingual system network to represent, say, we can think of this individual term, a person's multilingual meaning potential. So you can say, what would an interpreter have to know to be able to move between languages, or a translator, or a language learner, track the ontogenesis of the learning on the multilingual meaning potential, learning how to mean in a second language, or third or fourth, or whatever, right? So that's one way of thinking. But you also think about the community. What is the collective multilingual meaning potential of a community where different languages are spoken? Or, purely analytically, as it were, the linguist workbench, comparing, contrasting languages, typologizing languages, and so on and so forth. Okay? The intended bit then means, if you have this description, say, for example, of English, Dagare, Arabic, and Chinese, fine, that should represent the total potential of these four languages, but you should be able to extract the description of the potential of one language, and it should have full integrity. Okay? And in fact, that is something we achieved. Some references. And we'll continue working on this. First, more the framework, the computational implementational framework, but more recently applying it to typology, like Kazu Tsuruya. He led a whole team working on mood in different languages, and one aspect of this was a multilingual representation of the system of mood in, was it 7 different languages, Kazu? I can't quite remember now. But in any case, showing that this was possible. Kazu's worked also on, say, for example, aspects of transitivity in English and Japanese. Very, very interesting. And we're also trying to continue this, but also say, what would these implications be for second foreign language education? Let me give you a little bit of an example from the interpersonal area, more specifically. So I'll start with something that's fairly simple and local, with the realization of terms in the mood system. And at the same time, what I'd like to do is sort of illustrate how you can draw on the sort of systemic functional description of languages, the theory that lies behind it, and at the same time link to mine other resources, and in particular WARS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, a quite fantastic database resource that was developed by a team of people, Bernard Cumbray, Martin Hasselmath, and quite a few others. Okay. So you can take this sort of standard description of the mood system, and you move across languages, and you see these tend to be recurrent. So these are sort of very basic mood types that correspond to Michael Halliday's interpretation of the nature of human exchange of meanings, right? So you know the basic speech function. Information versus goods and services, giving versus demanding. So recurrent mood types, when you look across languages, are in fact indicative versus imperative, and within indicative, declarative versus interrogative. But this makes sense in view of the nature of human exchange of meanings. Or you could take this, you could take it all right back to Mauss's insights into human gift-giving, reciprocity being a basis of human communities. So, language after language will have a contrast, if you go to the interrogative area, between polar and elemental interrogatives. So for English we call these yes-no versus WH interrogatives, but to generalize, have general terms. What will vary, however, is how languages distinguish, say, the polar interrogative from a declarative. We know this from English. declarative, it's raining, polar interrogative, is it raining? So the well-known mood element in English, it is it, is it is, isn't it, and so on. Okay? Now, it turns out, when you look at typological accounts, you look at what people have done, system functional languages, you look at walls and so on, that there are a number of types. One is like English, so finite before subject, that's how you distinguish a polar interrogative from other mood types. Another is like Sami, so related to Finnish. You have a special function which is realized by what we could call interrogative or Q particle. Okay? So to mark the distinction between a declarative and a polar interrogative, you simply have a particle typically at the end of the beginning of the clause. Beginning as in Arabic, tel, right? Beginning as in say for example, Thai and Chinese and Japanese, very common in Southeast Asia. And then you have a kind of down-ranked version of this. You have, that's to the right, you have verbal morphology. So you have a verbal affix that signals this is an interrogative, this is a polar interrogative. Okay? And so, for example, if you look at India, you see you find a bit of both. But verbal morphology is, you can think of it as a particle that's pushed down and become part of the morphology of the verb. Okay? Finally, exemplified by Romanian here, but like a declarative structurally, except with a difference in prosody. So typically, falling tone versus rising tone. So rising tone for polar interrogatives. It might be something else, but something prosodic, right? Now, interestingly, when you map this onto a region of the world, and this is now a map generated by the online World Atlas of Language Structures, free of charge, you can just run around to your heart's content, picnic anywhere around the world and pick the features and so on. Then you see very often certain patterns emerge. I'll have to magnify this for you to be able to see this a bit. Okay? So top you have the same representation I had before, the mood system with the different realizational tactics for polar interrogatives, and then you have a map of North Africa, Western Eurasia. Okay? So again, let me magnify this a little bit. You have this. You recognize, oops, right? And all I've done then is to look at samples in the World Atlas of Language Structures of these different realizational types. Okay? So look at this map. Okay? So the different colors represent different realizational types. Okay? Yellow, that's what we're familiar with from English and German and Danish and so on. Okay? Blue, you see, blue, that's a particle, so a segment at clause rank. Red, that is a segment at a lower rank, so part of the verbal morphology. And sort of hardly visible grey, that's prosodic only, intonation only. Okay? Now, then you see something interesting. What we're so familiar with is sort of so foregrounded. Say, if one was only to read IFG as a description of English, right? That's very restricted even in Western Eurasia and North Africa. So you see, you just have a small group of languages, English, German, and then these tiny little languages like Danish and Swedish and Norwegian and so on, right? But only a certain region in Europe, okay? So you might say, okay, genetically Germanic language. Well, yes, but part of the but is you actually also have this possibility in French, right? Not the most common, as Alice Caffarel, for example, pointed out. Il pleut, pleut-il, right? But you'll also find when you look further afield on the map that, in fact, genetically unrelated languages, if they're in close contact, are likely, not necessarily so, but are likely to actually have the same realizational strategy. So it's not just genetics, it's areal, it can be an areal feature. And you see, the most dominant type in this part of the world is a particle. Okay? So if you look across the map, particle is the most common pattern. When you move further east, and the languages of Caucasus, then verbal morphology. But it's a general feature in where these grammars locate grammatical labor of realizing systems, clausal systems. So in general, in the language of the Caucasus, what we might in English as clause rank or group rank, they're likely to be at word rank, right? So it's a general feature. It's sort of resonant across. So the common feature is exactly you'd find in Arabic, with, as I said, hel, right? That's an example of this particle. Then lots of interesting questions. I won't go into it now, but you say, well, modern standard Arabic has been described as VSO in the typological literature. Is it coincidental that the particle comes at the beginning of the clause rather than at the end, as in Japanese, for example, which is described as SOV? Well, complex picture, but one that we look into and make systemic sense of. Systemic sense of the clause as a move in the construction of dialogue. So if you think about this, if you're constructing dialogue through the clause as a move, then it makes sense that sort of burning points will be when you start up a new move, saying this is what I'm trying to do relative to you. That's one way where you might signal I'm asking a polar question, hell, right? Or at the end of the clause, right? Ma, ka. We're saying, I'm about to hand over to you. Now, this is what I'm trying to do. This is what I'm doing. This is what I expect you to do in return. So these are actually the important dialogic points in the clause. So any of these, we can give a systemic functional analysis of the structure. So this example from Modern Standard Arabic, which I owe to Cantarino, I followed the sequence of writing, right? So what comes first in spoken is the negotiator, hell. Okay? Or alternatively, sort of cliticized to the verb right? But hell is written as freestanding. Then the predicator, and then the vocative in this example. Okay? So straightforward. We could continue, and we'd have a lovely few days moving around the world. Here is part of West Africa, and again you can see there are patterns, but I'm in the mode of moving around the world in 40 minutes, right? Let me now complicate the possibilities of description of patterns across languages. So this is a very local thing, just axial, moving from a system streaming description where you can say, well, actually up to a point, Chinese, English, Arabic, Dagara, Akan, and so on and so forth are fairly similar, but realization is structurally they're different, and we can separate out, we can tease these apart. Okay? So stay with the interpersonal, but now look at the potential of the mood system itself, just very briefly. So we're familiar with this common mood system, indicative, imperative, declarative, interrogative, and so on. Now it turns out, when you look at certain languages, that they've opened up another vector, a set of parallel systems, parallel with mood. Okay? So what this shows is actually a description of my interpretation of what's going on in Korean, right? So you have the mood system we looked at before on top, but then below you have another interpersonal vector. Okay? What's this concerned with? This is concerned also, in fact, with the negotiation of tenor relationship. So the well-known systems of speech level, of politeness, honorification, and so on, that you find in various languages. Famously, of course, Korean, Japanese, for example. So if I magnify this a bit, right, you can see the top system is mood, and the other system is interact and close contact. Okay? Close, are they familiar? In groupie, or distant. Okay? And then if they're close, then you have interact and status, familiar, intimate, plain, and if they're distant, a different set of systems, differential versus polite. Okay? So that's a way of reasoning about the possibilities. And of course they combine to form a fairly complex set of realizations, but they can be teased apart, analyzed, deconstructed as it were. Okay? So to understand the verb morphology of Korean, SOV, you can tease it apart systemically in this, and you can sort of sort out what's common to other languages, the top part, and what's specific to Korean, and you have some variant in Japanese, and so on. Okay. Let me now turn, so you see the potential of looking at things systemically, and we could move across languages and we say what kind of variation. We could increase the delicacy, and we can see, in fact, up to a point, languages have these categories, but then we can begin to identify likely further differentiations, greater delicacy within declarative, the two interrogative types, imperative, and these will vary across languages. And that will be part of the sort of accumulation of descriptions. And the accumulation of descriptions then will become part of what can inform us when we turn to a new language, right? Let me turn to an example where, in some sense, it doesn't seem quite that neat. Okay? And one interesting area to look at is one where we may have complementarities in languages. So it relates immediately to what Jeff was saying about complementarities. So this is in the construal of the time and the unfolding of the process. So as we've construed the flow of events, we chunk it into clauses. These clauses will have a sort of a nucleus. Maybe it's structurally absent, as the so-called nominal clauses in Arabic, right? But it will have, and that would be in many languages, the unfolding of this process in time would be construed through a grammatical system. So we move into the ideational area, exponential area of clause. Okay, so more specifically, construing of process in time as part of our experience of the flow events. Okay? And then we have the typical pattern of complementarity. If languages have grammaticalized such a system, it's tense or it's aspect, and now you have the complementarity, or both. So either tense or aspect, or both. And it's just the way that Jeff explained it to us this morning. So what's the principle here? With tense systems, so they have evolved grammatical resources for construing the location of the process in time. For example, past, present, future, or past, non-past, or present, non-present, or past, immediate past, remote past. There are many different possibilities. You're not coming up with 10 minutes yet, are you? Yes, okay. Or aspect, that's just for construing the bounding of time, not the location relative to now, but the bounding of event in time. Okay? But then there turns out to be languages that have both. Yeah? So, diagrammatic, you say you have something unfolding in time, it's construed as tense, say past, present, future, or as aspect, say perfected, imperfected. But then it turns out there are some languages with both. Now, so if you compare the outer ends of Eurasia, and this is a point that Michael Halliday has made, and sort of cottoned onto in the early 50s together with Jeff Ellis, at the eastern end of Eurasia you have Chinese, pure aspect, no trace of a grammatical tense system. At the western end, English, purely grammatical as tense, very little trace of aspect. Okay? For people like Michael Halliday who really understand aspect in languages like Russian and Chinese. Okay? So, complementary systems with different contrasts. Okay? For looking at this in time. Now, if we're thinking, what would this mean for the representation of a multilingual system? Well, this is where it gets a bit more complicated, right? We say, what would a translator between English and Chinese, or a learner of one language or the other, moving from one to the other, have to do? Well, they would have to have, as it were, grow two incommensurate models of time. Okay? So you sort of simply think of them notionally as simultaneous models of time, but it's one or the other. But the interesting thing is, how do you move from one to the other? Okay? And not surprising, it's not surprising, of course, that learners of English coming from Chinese, or the other way around, this is one area where they have real difficulties. Okay? Real difficulties. Similarly, how would a translator reconstrue the representation of process time going from one language to another? So there may be some areas where you're likely to have a sort of crossover point, right? So, for example, perfective aspect and secondary tense. Okay. Now, this is a kind of thing that if we were to now turn to typological resources that will act as a language structure, harder to investigate. So I want to give you this as an example of something that's a bit hard to investigate. You have to, as it were, make certain inferences. So they don't have full-scale data for different tenses and different aspect systems. But some features they have marked, thanks to Estendal and others. So one they have is past tense or no past tense in the language. Okay? So a number of hundreds of languages that they have investigated and mapped well. And the other is grammatical marking of aspect or not. Okay? And then you can see this simply I've intersected these two systems, systemic contrast, and which ones are popular, which ones are not popular. Well, having aspect and past tense, right, you get that very popular. If you have 4 past tense, that's not very common. But it's common to have 1 past tense and to mark for aspect, but even a bit more common not to mark for aspects. Okay? So if you want to give some examples of languages, right? So the blue column to the left in our foreground, that examples are Arabic, Russian and Hindi. Arabic, Russian and Hindi. Okay? Behind that would be English and Tamil, for example, from South India, Tamil. Okay? Now, intriguingly, if you map this on the world, you get quite a striking picture. Okay? So you see, in Western Eurasia, this tends to be dominated by tense, marking of past tense, no aspect. In Eastern Eurasia, this is dominated. You get in Chinese, Philippine languages, aspect, perfected, imperfected, no past tense. Okay? Then a little bit further south, neither grammaticalized. Okay? Then you go to South Asia, and South Asia is very much like Western Europe. But then, interestingly for us, where we are right now, you have a whole band going from, say, Morocco into Central Asia, or both. So these are mixed systems. These are the complementarity systems. So we could run through and we could look at this, right? 5 minutes. Okay? And then we could say, well, languages are being interested. Where do they fall, and how can I use this kind of... The descriptions are different to go on to develop further descriptions. Okay? So let me round off saying something about developing descriptions, developing new descriptions. Okay? Description of a new language. What would this be informed by? Well, by the kind of thing I've been talking about. Okay? But if we pull back a little bit, you see what I've been talking about, essentially descriptive generalizations based on systematically accumulating and comparing one description after another. But in systemic functional multilingual studies, that's then informed by the general theory of language that says languages are metafunctionally organized, they're systemically organized, they're stratified, they extended in delicacy, and so on and so forth. Right? So this is what informs it. Okay? So
can you read the key categories?
Yes. Okay. So top theory, so general theory of language, description, description of language A, B, C, D, and so on. Okay. Then you move over these. As we do when we compare and typologize and so on, we come up with descriptive generalization of the kind that I've illustrated. We say this is all part of what can inform the description of the new language. And I say this partly to get away from something we're all concerned about, that is taking a well-described language like Chinese or English or French or German or Arabic for that matter as a kind of the only resource when you turn to a new language. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Because there are so many descriptive generalizations and so much work we can get for the general theory. But then there is also, importantly, the evidence from discourse data. So to turn to the example of mood realization just briefly once again, if you take this description of English, you have a mood element, subject is ordered before the finite or after the finite, then it turns out that's very exotic, that's very unusual. So for most languages, we turn to new languages, forget it, we'll do something else. Okay? So that's very important. Okay? So when we look at sources of description, then these are sort of in a sense secondary. But we also have a primary source of description, which is actually getting text in different ways. Okay? Now, we can get text by sampling text. And if we sample text, we want to do it in an informed way, a registerally informed way. Okay?
has come up already in this conference. Or we do it by probing paradigms. Okay? That's elicitation. Okay? So there are lots of things to say about this, but let me round off now. And just say something in conclusion about multilingual studies. So what would the role of multilingual studies in SFL be? Okay? Well, lots of possibilities, and I alluded to some at the beginning. The topics like description, comparison, typology, translation, second language education. Okay? And we'd like to see sort of that multilingual studies do more work to benefit these. Okay? Generationally, it's very interesting. If you go to J.R. Firth, Michael Halliday, then this was first nature, not even second nature. You just worked on different languages. Halliday, as you know, worked on Chinese before it came to English. He worked on other languages. He looked at typology and so on, unpublished. But also regionally, in different parts of the meta-linguistic world of SFL, what are the concerns, what are people doing, right? So that's interesting to take account of. Importance and impact. Well, again, many different areas, but let me just say, by developing descriptions in multilingual studies, enabling text-based studies of samples of language around the world, say for educational concerns, administrative, human rights and so on. Enabling translation and interpretation studies in the context of our global village, globalization, supporting it, resisting it, whatever, but we need much more of a resource of descriptions of different languages and then compared and contrasted and so on. And enabling documentation of human semiotic heritage, of languages that are disappearing, taking their cultures with them. We need to document semodiversity for the purposes of maintenance and also revival. Okay? So I hope this will be a strand. It is already a strand in this conference, and I hope it will continue. And that's one reason why we're very excited being here, coming here, precisely because of the richness of exposure to new languages and new kinds of languages and so on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, for a stimulating talk with the usual wide range of coverage that we've got used to expecting from Christian. Now, we really must stop there, I'm afraid, with no questions, because otherwise it won't be fair to the next speakers. But Christian will be around for a bit longer.
I will, yes.
And that's the time when we can get back to him with questions. Thank you again very much, Christian.